So excited to see everybody coming in. I'm excited about sharing with you all today. We will go ahead and just let folks kind of trickle in, and then we will get started. I'm feeling really good today. It's super sunny outside, something not connected to the topic at all. I'm working on this really intense butterfly garden with my oldest child, and they insisted that we have a fountain, and the fountain came in last night. So I had to put the fountain together this morning at 6 a.m. And it's a solar powered fountain, and it's just like going nuts right now. So excited for them to come home and see that. All right, I burbled on along enough about that. I'm so excited again to share space with you today. We know camp people are in the busiest time of year, and so taking the time out for you to be here today, I'm humbled and grateful for. So today we're talking about doing more. Whatever it is, whatever you're doing now, just kind of pushing that boundary one more step to say, what more can I do? What more can my camp do? And I really wanted to break it down so we don't have to be paralyzed if our organizations aren't where we are, really thinking through how we can be doing these things organizationally, but also on a personal level, how can we be putting some of these things into practice if our organization isn't necessarily there in alignment, really thinking through each person's responsibility to get this work done. So we're talking today about how camps can support LGBTQ youth in our current climate. I do have to tell you, I'm in Ohio. House Bill 464 had a hearing today, which is a mimic of Florida's Don't Say Gay. So it has been a heavy day here. I'm really thinking about the youth that I know that is going to be impacted by that. But we are at over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills in state legislatures this year. Last year at this time, we were around 150, so twice as many. So I don't think any of the data that I'm going to share with you today is probably going to be very surprising. I was actually inspired to do this webinar when the 2020 National Survey on LGBTQ mental health came out. It is a project that is put on by the Trevor Project each year. So we have historical data going back about 3 or 4 years now, which is good. For a long time, there was no data on the effects of anti-LGBTQ things that proliferate in our society because nobody wanted to count it. Even counting these things was too controversial. So thankfully, the Trevor Project has stepped in and gives us some really good data. Over 34,000 participants were surveyed for this specific mental health survey. And I wanted to share 5 charts with you today because I don't want us to get lost. I don't want to go line by line through the report. I think that so much of it is hard to hear that I think if we go too much past 5, we start to get numb and we start to disconnect from what we can be doing. So I do want you to know that some of these things, while they're really hard to hear, end in some really good information about what action can do to mitigate some of these harmful things that are happening. So I think this is the hardest one. And this is actually the chart that it was like, no, we're going to do something right now in May when everybody is losing, sleep all the time and nobody has enough time, but it's still important because of this. First off, symptoms of anxiety in LGBTQ youth has increased by 5%. That should be a decrease. Like we should be striving for a decrease. And I know many of us are, but we also have to understand that this is a direct correlation of what's happening in our world. We really started to see this barrage of anti-LGBTQ legislation last year in 2021. Obviously, the pandemic has an effect on LGBTQ youth just as much as everybody else, if not a little bit more, since they're required to be at home, possibly with affirming caregivers. But we have seen a 5% increase in anxiety. And depression looks like it peaked in 2021. Again, we're still higher than where we were in 2020. And also 55%, the lowest number of that set, is still too high. And then this is the one that I have to really call out, is that we have seen a 5% increase in LGBTQ youth who are seriously considering suicide. And it's too high. 40% is way too high. 45% an increase is not okay. And then when we look at the actual rate of attempted suicide, 15% was too high, 14% is too high. And yes, it has decreased 1%. And I'm grateful for that 1%. And we have to be thinking about what we can do more to mitigate some of these statistics. I want to talk about specifically the trans community because we are uniquely affected. A lot of the legislation is directly targeted at trans youth, not allowing them access to life-saving gender-affirming care. We know that gender-affirming care saves kids' lives, period. That is fact, that is data. And so kids not having access to that can be really difficult. We know that 93%, and this isn't in this chart, but something worth mentioning, 93% of trans youth are afraid they're not going to have access to healthcare, to trans-affirming healthcare. We're going to talk about it later, but like, what is that doing to kids who should be, out playing t-ball or whatever? Older kids don't play t-ball. You know what I mean? So we just have to think through what these kids should be doing. And then what they're actually doing is worrying about whether they're going to have a doctor who understands them. But looking at this chart, I want to call out that the most targeted or the highest level of suicide risk is transgender boys and men. So 59% have considered suicide in the last year. 22% have been a suicide attempt. And then kind of foil that with cisgender boys and men who are at the very lowest of this rate, with 28% considering suicide and 6% attempting suicide. The last data I saw was that across the board, teenagers' risk of suicide is of attempted suicide is 8%. So if that contextualizes any of that information. So for a trans boy or a trans man, we're looking at about 3 times the risk for their cisgender peers. It's also compounded by race. We know that people of color, or especially LGBTQ people of color, are experiencing this in a whole another level. And I think this is important for camps to consider, because we're all talking about, we should all be talking about racial justice. And a lot of camps are talking about racial justice, but racial justice and gender and sexuality justice cannot be separated. They are two things that affect each other very deeply. And we can't prioritize one over the other. There are Black LGBTQ kids, and they are at a higher risk for suicidal ideation and behavior. We see the highest risk set is for Native and Indigenous folks. So we still have to be thinking through, how do we do these things and these things? And I know it's a tall order, but it's also very, very important, and at least the conversation we should be starting. This one I want to point out, and why I selected this chart was because when I go into a camp to work with a camp, so much of the focus is around how do we keep cisgender kids safe when we introduce trans kids. And that's a problem, because cisgender kids are not at the same risk for being physically threatened or harmed as trans kids. Trans kids are statistically way more likely to be harmed, threatened, harmed, assaulted in spaces, starting with 55% of transgender boys and men were threatened or harmed in the last year due to their gender identity. Trans girls and women were assaulted or threatened at 47%, and non-binary and genderqueer youth were harmed or threatened at 32%. It's too high, and it needs to be the priority to make these spaces safe for these folks who are, where this is not a theoretical violence that's happening. A lot of times when we talk about the threat of violence, it's not even an actual threat. These aren't even threats. Like this is actual instances of actual young people who this is happening to. And we have to be prioritizing that over people being just kind of uncomfortable based on societal norms of what safety should look like. this is where the action is. This is where the action is. And I want to end the statistics there, because I think this is the most important thing that we can walk away with, is suicide risks are absolutely diminished when they have communities that accept them. Again, I want to remind you, the overall suicide risk for all teenagers is around 8%. You see, for LGBTQ young people who have very accepting communities, their suicide risk is also 8%. All we have to do is create very accepting communities, and we have to be moving past this fear that it's going to do harm to anybody else, that it's going to be too hard, that our board is going to be upset, and they might be, and we're going to talk about that. But we just have to be pushing ourselves into this very accepting community space. The other piece that I want to hold space for in all of this is that, like, trans and LGBTQ kids living into adulthood should not be the goal. Trans and queer joy should be the goal. People being people joy should be the goal. Like they want to be able to show up at the Gaga pit and do all of the same things as everybody else, in the same way that everybody else does. And to have that experience, we have to create these very accepting communities. So we're going to talk about organizationally first. We obviously can make a really big impact organizationally if we can. I know it's hard to rewrite a policy like right now in May, and we still have to be thinking of the ways we can show up in these spaces, because the work is needed now. And that impact can be really large. Starting with, have a clear plan for creating safer facilities. And so many folks think like, well, our shower house could never be inclusive. And I think there are ways that we can really get a little bit more creative. You don't have to build a capital campaign for millions of dollars to rebuild your shower house. Like, there's things that you can be doing right now that are low budget, cost effective, that will make a huge difference. So starting with, anyone should be able to use a restroom or changing room that they feel is in alignment with their gender, period, right? Like, if somebody feels like they should be in this space because that's who they are, they should be in that space because that's who they are. Now, we have to follow that up with these vulnerable spaces who really have quality supervision. I want to mention here that sometimes, and for a long time, the school of thought has been, if the boys are in this bathroom and the girls are in this bathroom, then nothing bad is going to happen. And we know that is categorically untrue, right? Like, bad things happen in these vulnerable spaces. So we need to amp up our quality supervision for everyone. Everybody should have an understanding as part of their community orientation, how we behave in these spaces, including the very important information that there's only one person per bathroom stall, there's only one person per shower stall, there's only one person per bed. If you can institute that rule across the board and campers see that as an act of respect for the campers that they're living with, we've at least gotten halfway there, because you can have the world's best facilities and you can have locking doors. And if we haven't had a discussion about what privacy and consent looks like, once you miss your buddy, you're crawling under the bathroom stall because you miss them so much and you want to say hi to them. This is six-year-old thinking. So we have to make sure that as part of our community or orientation, that is part of the conversation. Everyone should be able to change in privacy. And this is part of the universal design that makes everybody more safe. For a long time, people did showers all together in a huge open thing. And that was not safe for many folks. There are so many reasons a kid could want to change in private, and all of those reasons should be honored. Not only that, but to make trans kids change in private when everybody else can kind of change in communal spaces singles them out. It creates stigma around their situation, and it also sends the unintended message that they should be ashamed of their body because it's different. Most trans kids are not going to want to show their bodies to anybody, and that should absolutely be okay, but we shouldn't be forcing them to feel ashamed of it. That's something that we want to be working with them on, is everybody should be able to change in the same way. Everybody should have access to privacy, and nobody should feel like they're the only person who has to change in a space by themselves. I think we really have to understand how we hold space for the hard stuff. This young person here with this sign, her name is Kay Shipley. She's an 11-year-old trans girl activist in Texas. And Kay Shipley should not be at the State House holding a banner that says this. She should be going to roller skating parties or selling Girl Scout cookies, not spending her time at the State House trying to secure her own survival. And still, this is the reality for so many LGBTQ youth. Again, this hearing happened in Ohio today, and I know a lot of young people who took the day off school to be there. We have to be considering this, and we can't stop all the harmful things that are happening. You know, like some of this is just beyond our power and control, but we have to make it clear as much as possible that our organizations welcome people like Kai, that they welcome people like anybody else who's experiencing this harm. We want them to know that they're going to be loved and cared for in our spaces, because everything that is happening is telling these young people that they're not going to be welcomed into their schools, into their faith communities, into community organizations, into youth sports. Like, this is going to be an overriding fear for these kids, that they're not going to have spaces that include them. I like to say there should never be fear about putting more love into the world, and that's all I'm asking you all to do, is to put more love out into the universe. Make an organizational statement. If you can't make an organizational statement, make a personal statement. Any ways that you can put out that this stuff is hard and it's not okay, that's going to be beneficial to the people, the small people, the young people who look up to you as their heroes, as their mentors. And we know camp people are like the best heroes and mentors. So yes, of course, please write your congressperson, write your legislators, all of those pieces, very important. And I say 25% upward, 75% downward. 75% of that time should be thinking about how we can care for the people who this is affecting the most, because that is very actionable and very important. And celebrate the joyful stuff, you know, like think about why or why not your camp celebrates Pride. You know, camps should be thinking about this as a celebration, because it is a celebration of pride for everyone. Pride is actually a celebration of coming from like the queer history of the Stonewall riot, which was basically a moment where people were in this bar in New York City. The bar was raided, and they said, that's enough. We've had enough. And that was the beginning, not the beginning. There's no beginning, but that was kind of as the movement was really taking off for queer liberation. So if we see that as the flashpoint for the celebration of Pride, we can also understand that it is a very similar celebration to like the 4th of July, which also, with all of the problems that it has, which I think are way more problematic than a celebration of liberation, it is also rooted in a moment where some people who were kind of being oppressed were like, enough, this is enough, I've had enough. And we celebrate that because we have moved past the fact that it's controversial. Some of us, many of us obviously have not, but Pride is the same thing. It is a celebration of people who did not have the rights and freedoms as everybody else and started to say, like, no, we're not doing that. And also, it's really fun, and it's really fun to see you celebrated, not just accepted, but celebrated. So think about if you have the capacity to do that in your space, and think about what that could possibly look like. And also, who doesn't love a party? Who doesn't want a mid-season, whatever you do to celebrate? So celebrations, again, putting more love out into the world should never be problematic. Normalize sharing pronouns. One of the easiest ways to lower a trans youth's risk of suicide, and I would say it probably lowers all LGBTQ kids' risk of suicide because it shows that there's community available, is using the right name and pronoun. So it cuts their risk in half, in half, in half. It seems like it would be an easy one to me. So normalize what sharing pronouns in your space looks like. And, you know, if you're not to a point organizationally where your leadership is like, yes, let's do this as part of every introduction circle, at least share your own pronouns. Think about having buttons. Think about allowing kids to add it to their cabin signs. There are micro steps that we can be taking where we can normalize this in small increments so we can get to the big stuff eventually. We're so afraid of parent confrontations. If we do this thing, we're going to upset these people. I would invite us all to think a little bit more about the parents who are upset that their kid doesn't have a safe space at your camp, who doesn't have a safe space at school. I have spoken to a lot of parents, and as the parent of somebody who is going to go to camp for the first time, I feel so limited in the camps that I can send my child to because there's not more outpouring and understanding of what it means to be inclusive in websites. So there are parents, what I'm saying is that there are parents who are not coming to your program because they don't feel safe to send their kid there. But we're so concentrated on the people who are going to be mad about inclusion that we don't think about this other group of people who so badly want a space in the program. And the other part of this that makes it even more hard is that the people who are mad are much louder because they have a lot more social capital, and they haven't been taught that we can't disallow people from being in a space and being wholly included. So what I'm saying is we can't do nothing because we're afraid of who's going to be upset at us. Right is right, regardless of who else is doing it. We know this is right. We know that it lowers these risks. It creates joy. LGBTQ kids should have access to all of the beautiful things that we do at camp. So we have to push past this. And that doesn't mean you don't want to prepare. You don't want to be caught off guard by parent confrontations, because as you introduce inclusive practices, that's probably going to be a reality. So think through who is the point person for that. Here's a clue. Try not to make it someone who is in the LGBTQ community, because it's going to be a much more personal and much more vulnerable experience if that is the case. So think about, again, who is well-versed in this conversation, who has the talking points, based on what inclusive practices you have decided to institute this summer. You will want to have talking points for some of the things that parents might call and say. And angry people are going to be angry. There is a section of the population that no matter how many statistics you show them from the Trevor Project or the harm that's being done or the true things that are happening with these young people, they're still going to be mad about it. I like to call those folks the never going to get it. And there's nothing that we can do to bring them on board. So if we roll out these inclusive practices and if parents are mad about it, we really need to be mindful of how much energy we're putting in to trying to convince people to stay who are not going to stay unless we change back or we revert back. And I also really want to warn you about anytime you introduce an inclusive practices and then you revert back, what message that sends to the campers who are so excited to share their names or pronouns, or so excited to have gender inclusive housing because it was the first time they had a safe space. And then you're like, nope, just kidding. Like, these people were too mad about it. Like, that would do some real harm, break some real trust with future camps, future adults in general. So just be thinking about, you don't want to be paralyzed by this. And you also want to be really intentional to not roll these things back, because once people are excited about being included, it can be really jarring to have that kind of taken away from you. I think this is really, really important. I guarantee you that someone is going to want to use a pronoun other than he or she this summer in your camp space. Regardless of age, regardless of what your program is geared toward, your location, there is probably a high likelihood that somebody is going to want to use a they, them pronoun or a different pronoun. And because of the way youth work has worked for so long, these conversations have been silenced and nobody is well practiced on what do you say in that moment. Are they allowed to do that? Is this okay? Who am I going to tell? Who do I have to tell? Do I have to report this? Like, do I need to fill out a form? And that's going to be really hard for that camper in that moment who has just told you something really, really valuable about themselves. So because we're untrained on this, and because in fact there's legislation pending in many states trying to say that we absolutely cannot do this in schools, which none of those laws actually, they don't apply to camps, my understanding and my reading of them. But because this is being said so often in schools, we have not trained our staff to have some of these really important conversations. So we really have to train our staff on the things that are really important. Things like, what language do we use? What does affirmation look like? How can we create safe spaces? You know, the bathroom and facilities piece, if those are all of your policies and we never talk about the why of those things or the how of those things, it's not going to affect the overall camp community. So think about the way you're training your staff in all spaces for inclusion, and intersectional inclusion as well. Again, for so long, I mean, we know that the camp industry has been a white, straight, cisgender industry for a long time, and we really have to reckon with that and think about how we do train our staff in really bold and new ways. And putting the focus on how that affects campers' mental health, I think is kind of the key to the success here. Is we're not taking time out of our busy schedule to do this. This is just as important as CPR. And I don't have the stats or the figures on this, but I'm going to say it anyway, just knowing that like it's a hunch, it's not like found in data, but I think you are significantly more likely to save someone's life by having training to support LGBTQ youth's mental health than you are by taking a CPR course, right? Like the statistical possibility of a young person or a person on our property having a heart attack is pretty low. And we still usually make sure that at least one or two, if not all of our staff has spent 4 hours doing CPR training. So we have to prioritize this because we know the great impact that it can have on these people and these programs. And it's good for everyone. And that's the other part, is this making sure that you have inclusive practices isn't just good for LGBTQ kids, right? Like creating an inclusive environment is good for all kids because it makes them build that empathy bridge. It makes them understand people aren't like them, and that's okay. You know, we really work through some restorative practices on how to be kind to people who we don't even have to understand their experiences to affirm their experiences. But if we haven't trained our staff on this, it's just going to be like, we got to get to archery, but don't talk about that. And that doesn't help us grow. We get to archery, everybody probably still has fun, but the person who shared who they were or have been mistreated because their gender expression is something different than what people expect, they're not having fun at archery. So we have to make sure that they have access to that as well. I think this one is a symptom of camp counselors and camp people. We are superheroes, and we want to be superheroes, and we want to be able to fix everything, but we really have to understand like where our responsibility ends and when to enlist outside help, and really understanding with these high rates of suicide, suicidal behavior, self-harm, we have to know where we have to enlist someone beyond the scope of just a camp counselor or even a camp director to help this person find access to positive mental health. And we also have to understand what our responsibility to them is when they leave our gates. And I think our responsibility, while it ends at the gates, right? Like you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you're crossing boundaries. You know, you don't want to overstep anything that would put you into kind of a liability situation with overstepping after the camp week has ended. I think the key here is to connect campers with other resources or empower them to connect themselves with other resources that can kind of mimic the inclusion that you have built into your program. Because if we're doing things right, these kids are going to come, they're going to be pumped. We're going to include them in ways that they, again, might not have experienced in their homes, in their schools, anywhere else. And then unfortunately, every camp session is going to end, and we can't just allow them to revert back to expecting to be treated the ways that they had before they got there. So thinking about the community resources that you have that you can empower them to connect with, always inviting them to share it with at least one affirming adult in their life, who they are, so they can have that adult support outside of our space, but also letting them know if there's an LGBTQ youth center in your town, in your community, just making sure that they have been empowered to connect with community outside once our week has ended. And again, it's May. I know I keep telling you all that it's May, and you know this. So that means we're not doing any rewrites on policy right now, probably. If you are, Godspeed. And I'm proud of you. And if you don't have a policy, we still have to have a plan, because these kids are very real. They're very important. And again, like, we know that coming out of COVID, kids were at home, youth were at home for a long time. They were out of the scope of like peer pressure, to be peer pressured to just conform to societal norms of gender or sexuality. And a lot of kids figured out who they were. And that means almost every camp that I've talked to last year, we're like, there were so many people, there were so many kids, and we didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to support these ideas. Like, we had planned for a pandemic, and we ended up with pronouns, and how do you do both at the same time? So we have to have a plan. We have to really think through the things that could probably happen, the things that might happen, and at least have an idea of what we would do. So I want you to just take a minute, and I'm not going to tell you all of the answers to these things because it could go on all day long. But these are things that could very possibly come up at your camp. And I just want you to think, like, would I know what to do in this case? Starting with someone who was assigned female at birth, but is now male, wants to swim in only trunks. So a trans boy who's come to camp for a long time, who is assigned female at birth, wants to swim in trunks, just like the other boys. Do we have a plan for what that's going to look like? When we make that plan, whose voice has we centered? Who would it harm based on any decisions that we're going to make? What are we going to do when campers say that they're uncomfortable with someone else's gender or sexuality? Are our staff going to be empowered to have a conversation that heals everyone who feels like they've been removed from safety through that type of dialogue? Are our counselors going to know how to have that conversation? Or are they just going to rely on this old idea that we can't talk about this at all, so we just have to not talk about it at all? Again, training them in the ways that we can do this can be really, really important for them, but will also at least start the conversation in a way that they feel empowered to help those kids when that happens. When campers say something like, my caregivers don't believe in transgender people, again, are we equipping our staff with the words to say when that happens? Because in that moment, and even this is my everyday, like, this is what I talk about every day. Until I developed a strong script around what words I would use in that situation, it's really hard to think in the moment, especially if you don't know your camp's your camp stance on this, or what you have the capacity to say, thinking that you're going to get in trouble if you're too affirming of trans folks. So making sure that your staff are prepared for that. What are you going to do when a camper comes out and they don't want their parents to know? What are your policies surrounding that? What are you teaching your frontline staff about that? A camper's parents tell you they don't want you to use the name and pronouns the camper has asked to use. This is a really common one that we see in a lot of camps, where the camper says, I want to use this name, and the parents say, under no circumstances are you ever going to be allowed to use that name. What is our role in that as youth development professionals? How do we make that decision? How do we inform the parents? How do we have that dialogue with both parents and campers? It can get messy really quickly. Or if a staff member comes to camp with a gender identity you weren't expecting, thinking through how would I make that decision as well? I think that this is some great advice. And if you don't know, if you don't have the answer to all of those questions, really know what resources you have available in your community so that you can answer those questions in empowering ways. A lot of times when we go with our gut instinct on these things, that gut instinct is going to be very much reliant on our experiences, you know, with what is comfort and who should be empowered, who should make these decisions. So we just have to really check ourselves to make sure that when we make these decisions, we're centering the most vulnerable. We're making sure that it's good for our program, but it's good for all of the kids in our program equitably. And if you don't have the answer to that, make sure you're reaching out to someone who does have experience in making some of these decisions. And not so they can make the decision, but they can ask you the right questions to help you make the best decision for everyone in your program. So those things are all kind of the organizational things, but I want, again, to really push folks to be thinking a little bit more globally about their personal responsibility in all of this. One thing, I read a study recently that in like top universities in the United States, almost all the academics in the institutions say we're not doing enough for inclusion. But if individuals are saying we're not doing enough, then how is the institution saying we are doing enough? Like that, we have to change things from the inside out. The first thing and foremost, I come from a small town in Kentucky, so I understand the restrictions of communities and what we're able to do in different demographic spaces. But again, it's more important to create inclusive spaces in unaffirming communities because we know that there's more risk there, you know, based on the suicide statistics that I shared with you at the beginning of this presentation. So what can you do personally? Rogue affirmation. Let me talk to you about rogue affirmation. Rogue affirmation is this idea that we can affirm people without having to have like rules and policies. And sometimes that means we might get ourselves in trouble. But really thinking through that moment where it's like, okay, our policy says this, and I know that this is harmful, and I'm part of this camp, and I love this camp, and also like, I don't believe in that. And we all have to think of when it has reached a point where the value mismatch is so great that we need to take our love elsewhere. And, you know, I'm not saying like everybody go get out and get fired today because, you know, you're doing all of these things and your organization isn't ready. I'm just saying, think about it. You know, think about, again, when has it reached a point where this is not going to change in this space, but I have so much more to give that I could go to another space and do good. We're so scared of getting in trouble sometimes that we don't really lean into doing the hard stuff that we also know is the right stuff. And I know that that's very scary. I know it also takes a certain position of privilege to just say like, I'm going to do what's right, even though I might lose my job. So I'm not saying that any of that is easy. I think that each person needs to kind of weigh out what that looks like for them and really push as much as we can safely and just not accept that some of these things are going to continue to happen again because people are afraid of caregivers or this thing or that thing. I think we can do this without having to have like an organizational based policy, and that is if a camper shares who they are, we have to lead with affirmation, you know, and that is if you are directly in contact with a camper who shares who they are, regardless of what your policy says, there are ways that you can lead with affirmation on many different levels. And I want to talk through this just a little bit more. The first thing you can do in this situation is to listen to that person. So we're not interjecting. We're not like commandeering the conversation. We're just giving space for this young person to tell us who they are. And maybe that's something they've never told anybody before, or maybe they were really nervous to come to camp because they were worried they were going to be unsafe. So we're going to give them the space to really talk through what they want to share with us. You know, I think we can ask limited questions about like, what does that mean to you? A lot of times when somebody comes out, they're like, I just want you to know that I'm a pansexual. And I think the best thing to do is say like, well, what does that mean to you? What is that? How does that show up for you? And helping them understand that like they are in control. I also know that youth are pretty into labels, like they all want to find their label, and I think it's because they want to know which flag belongs to them. But I think we have to be asking them like, what does that identity mean to you? You know, like how does that show up? you know, in obviously appropriate non-sexual ways. Like we're not into anybody's business like that, but really thinking through, like, what does this mean for you? How does it show up for you? What are you scared about? And leaving those things to the end of the listening conversation. So once there's kind of been that lull, and then the first and foremost thing that we want to do is say thank you. We want to say thank you for sharing that information with me, because it was probably hard. You might have been really nervous about that, and I really appreciate you picking me. It's a humbling thing to happen when somebody chooses you to share this vulnerable information with, because you have established yourself as a safe person. So we want to make sure that we affirm whatever they told us. And I think this is the stage at which it looks different for every person in every organization. And that's the empower stage, because when somebody comes out to us, as a camper comes out to us, what are they looking for? You know, what are the needs that they need met kind of immediately in that situation? You know, are they wanting to use a different pronoun? How can we make sure we're helping them use that pronoun? Do we have a policy that says they're not allowed to use that pronoun? In which case we would say, like, I understand who you are completely, and I'm sorry, organizationally, we're just not there yet. And I think that's garbage. Again, you're probably going to get yourself in trouble, but saying that sentence to that camper says an adult cares about me, and they understand that this is unfair, and they understand that this is harmful. So empowering also might mean, like, do you want to use a different restroom? Like, are there considerations that you need us to share? So really just empowering them to name what safety looks like to them based on the information that they've shared with you. This is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I think that we talk about microaggressions a lot, which is a subtle act of exclusion, right? Sometimes it's not meant to be that way, or something that's kind of come in our language, but many microaggressions over time can really wear folks down. Microaffirmation is the exact opposite of that. So like a subtle act of inclusion or kindness that expresses the organic inclusion of a marginalized population. I think there's a lot of different ways we can kind of just like drop microaffirmations in our culture, in our camp culture, in our cabin culture, like whatever level you're at. Microaffirmations, like some examples based on gender identity or sexuality, is just like, if it's somebody who seems like they might have been assigned male at birth, or for anybody, like, your nail polish looks amazing. If that is something that is not stereotypically expected for someone of their identity or expression, then what you have just said is like, I see you, and I think that's awesome. I think this can be really an easy way to do it, like giving those compliments in ways that it's just like, I see that. It's cool. Like I'm a safe person for you to express that with. Storybooks, making sure that if you do any books at all, including books with families that look like all different types. I think this is a really good way to just have organic inclusion. If we're reading books that have moms and dads in them, we should definitely be reading books that have multiple different kinds of families in them, because whether or not people agree with this, like, this is a family makeup that is relevant, it is valid, they exist, and we can't really just pretend that it doesn't because it makes some people upset. But that type of representation can, again, show somebody that you are welcome here, your stories are welcome here, your family is welcome here. Anyone can wear any clothes that make them feel good, right? Like, we hear young people say, oh, yeah, I can't wear that, those are boy shorts, or you shouldn't wear that, that's for girls. And we have to nip that. And I think one simple pivot of anyone can wear any clothes that make them feel good, period, right? Like, is this piece of clothing making you unsafe? Great, then you can wear it. We want to make sure that that language is kind of included in our conversations. Same thing. We often hear kids, and sometimes even staff, say, like, this activity is for girls, or this activity is only for boys. And again, like, nipping that really quickly with, there's no such thing as girl activities and boy activities. Anybody can do any activity that makes them feel good, that is appropriately supervised by counselors, and when they're following the rules, like, it doesn't matter what gender they are. I think this also comes into play as we think about our assumptions of what people of different genders should and shouldn't do. So for example, if you take the boys to arts and crafts and they're like, okay, we're going to get the paint out. We don't get the pink paint out because boys don't like pink. We are just kind of reestablishing that boys shouldn't like pink. So then they think they shouldn't like pink. So next time we're at arts and crafts, we don't get out pink. And it just goes and goes and goes, and until it creates this, truth that doesn't necessarily mean to exist. Any color is for anybody. Any activity is for anybody. Again, well supervised, keep that in mind. Anyone can have a crush on anyone of any gender, if, again, depending on your camp culture, how you talk about relationships, but crushes come up, right? Like, we shouldn't be not denying that young people are going to think about this or replicate this. I mean, they've seen the news and they're humans, but if crushes come up, just making sure that everybody knows, like, anybody can have a crush on anyone of any gender. Again, if it makes them feel happy, anyone can do that. And making sure that we know that families look a lot of different ways. Just the representation of that can be really, really important. If another camper says to somebody who has two moms or doesn't have two moms, like, oh, what are your mom and dad's names? Just saying that, like, we can't assume that they have two moms. Like, families look a lot of different, a mom and a dad. Families look a lot of different ways, and we want to hold space and we want to honor that. So those are my biggest tips for the summer. I hope what you can do is take at least one of these tips. We call it a single mark of progress, like one thing that you can do this summer that you can kind of promise yourself that you're going to think about, that you're going to hold yourself to after we are done here today. Like, write it down on a piece of paper, put it on your mirror. Like, one thing can have huge ripple effects. And I know that you all are going to have so many people in your care this summer. And I'm so grateful that they're going to be with you all. And we have a lot of work to do. And I know that if we just each do one thing, we can make a huge difference. So I'm going to take some questions now. I think if we can put questions in the chat, I'll have Allison read them. And then I hopefully can answer anything that kind of came up for you. So you can put questions in the chat there.
Yeah, Chris, we have a question that I will read from one of our friends already. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. I love questions.
I think it's a great question. It's, how do we navigate carefully such that we don't set trans and queer youth up for disappointment? As in, providing an inclusive, affirming, and celebratory environment, how do we ensure that our campers don't get hit too hard by the come down as they re-enter a potentially unwelcoming, unaccepting, exclusive place?
Yeah. It's such a hard one. And I think it is just being really intentional and honest with campers. This is what we are prepared to provide. And acknowledging that if it's not enough, it's not enough. Just again, like, we're saying to them basically, like, we know we don't have all of these policies together, and we know that we can be doing better, and we are moving that direction. So you're not saying like, no, we don't care about your safety, and actually you should feel safe because we're doing all of these things already. You're saying like, we know we can be doing more. I think anytime we can have that informed consent conversation, it can be really, really valuable. I worked with an organization earlier this year who only has male and female bunks, period. Like, that is organizationally where they are. And so I think then when you talk to, like, in that case, like a non-binary person who wants to come to your program, the best kind of tact I would take is being just really honest with them. Like, this is what we have to offer right now, and we know that doesn't exactly fit your needs. And we want to empower you to say, like, this is not a space for me yet, or let us know what we can do realistically to ensure your safety this summer. You can be in this cabin or this cabin, and we know those are binary cabins, but we can do other things that might not be enough for you at this time. But if you're willing to try, like, we're willing to do that. Again, centering their safety completely, I think, is the way to go in that situation.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit too about, let's say, like, camps are doing everything that they can, and they live in a place, maybe their school, their home, their community, that is not making the progress that camp has. Like, how do we help them cope with, not utopia because it's not perfect, but a so much more of a welcoming environment, and then just passing them back into the world?
Yeah, I think the community piece of that is the really important piece, like making sure that they have the resources to connect with communities, right? Like you're not like playing a matchmaker, you're not connecting them with those, like you're empowering them to make that connection themselves. And then also like having that conversation of, we are so grateful that you could be yourself here this week, and like it was so exciting to give you that experience, and we know that going home might be hard. Have you thought about what that might look like? Have you thought about how you're going to take care of yourself? Are there resources that we can give you, instead of just like not addressing the question at all? Just preparing them for that possibility can at least get things started in a way where they feel empowered to make their own safety at home. And also the understanding that like this safety should not end here. Like that should not be the case. That's unfair to you, and we acknowledge that. Just knowing that like you should be demanding safety like this everywhere you go if you feel safe to do so.
Yeah, and also like from a program note, again, I'm not the expert nearly that you are in this area, but I do think I'm good at community outside of camp. So can you have more sessions? Like, can you do a Halloween camp? Can you do more weekend camps? Can you give them opportunities to be safe in your space? And then like, how can you leverage your social media to just sometimes be a positive message for your campers that without saying, without being like a big statement, just says like, hey, we love you, we're thinking about you, we care about you, and like a little positive thing that goes a little bit further than I think that people think sometimes.
One beautiful thing that Camp Stomping Ground did last year when legislation was working its way through that part of the country was they sent like just little love notes and care packages to all of their campers who they knew were out to their caregivers, just to say like, this sucks and this is not going to happen in our space. You are still welcome here. And like, what a beautiful thing to do, to just like send that. Again, you wouldn't want to out anybody. You would want to know for sure that their parent knew about this. But again, camp people are rock stars to these people. So I think that's the way to go that way. Yeah.
Thank you. We have lots of questions. This next one is, how would you handle the bathing suit situation so that everyone feels safe and included to be themselves?
Yeah, this is a hard one. And I'll give you kind of the short answer is either everybody has to wear shirts or nobody has to wear shirts. And I think the nobody has to wear shirts is going to be really, really problematic. So what it comes down to is that like there's just this existing understanding in our society that males don't have to wear shirts and females do. And first off, can we just name that's like, I'm not gonna curse. I'm not gonna curse. It's just not good. But I think so. What we do is we create a space where every camper has to cover their chest, and that is an equitable solution. And then the next question is, well, that's not fair to the boys. And then the next step of that conversation is like it's never been fair to girls that they have to cover their chests, right? Like there is already an inbred unfairness. So it feels like we're taking something away because we are, but it was something that should have never existed. Also, UV rays are very bad for skin. And I think you can spin it in that way. So it doesn't have to be about like a leftist gender ideology, which that term is not even a real term. But you can couch it in that, and it is legitly better for everybody else's skin that everybody wears a shirt.
Perfect. Our camp is providing gender affirming aids, specifically chest binders, to campers this summer upon their request. At this time, our board and senior team require us to receive parental consent, which may require outing campers before providing this resource to those who need them. How might we work toward expanding that access toward equity in years to come?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I am not often stumped. Okay, just give me 1 second. I'll take a drink of water. I'm going to answer the question. All right, it's happening. Okay, all right, I got it. This is what I think is the most important part of that is if that is two things. Right now, that is a conversation with the camper. You know, like, again, we're naming like, we know that this policy is not as affirming as it should be. However, like this is as far as we could get this summer. So we can make sure that you have that binder and we can help you have that conversation with your parents. Otherwise, right now, we just can't do it. We're thinking through new ways. Then we need to look at how do we advocate to our board for next year. You know, how do we make sure that they have the right information to make the right choice? I think I think there is a little bit of pushback there because it is like a physical thing that happens. With binding especially, yes, it is like the best thing you can do for a trans kid who feels like they need that, but also like it's not the healthiest thing to do physically. Now, the obviously risk benefit, the emotional part of it escalates here, but I do think like there's some like body stuff that we have to consider with parental consent and that mode. But yeah, so I think I would just, say like, we can do this. We still need consent. But also like, are there other ways that we can make your body feel safe? Could we make sure that you could stay in air conditioned space? And I don't even like that, but we see a lot of campers who have like chest dysphoria or body dysphoria when we're like sweatshirts all the time. Is there a way we can make sure you're in a space where you can wear a sweatshirt and you can feel safe that way? So is there any other ways that we can make your body feel safe besides just this one that we unfortunately at this point have to provide that? Was that Tyler's question?
Yes.
Tyler, I love you too.
Emily said that they have pronoun buttons available. They used to have buttons available with pronouns, but last summer staff said that the sharing of pronouns can also be triggering. Not sure how they should approach that this year.
Okay. Yes, I see where mandating people to take a pronoun pen could be triggering. Providing the option that people take a pronoun pen, I think, while that, yes, could be a triggering something that happens, if it's optional and you don't have to take one, then ultimately I don't feel like it's infringing on your personal personhood, because everybody, for the most part, uses a pronoun. So not sharing our pronouns, people are automatically just going to use whatever they think is right, which obviously sometimes can be wrong. So I think the big piece there is the choice and consent part, of making sure that we understand that this might be hard and you might not want to take one today, and that's great. And if you don't, we're going to use your name in place of a pronoun because we don't know what pronoun you use, and out of respect, like that's kind of what we should be doing. So I think I would also dig a little bit deeper with that staff member specifically of like, what feels triggering about it to you? Is it that you feel like you have to do it and then you don't want to do it? Or I think I would need to know a little bit more about why the triggering occurred. But again, like, people are going to use pronouns regardless of whether you have a button or not. So to pretend like people don't have choice and control over that, I think that's just kind of a miss.
Thank you. Could you speak to the idea that we are furthering an ideological divide by driving some camper families away from camp where those kids may interact with transgender people versus another camp where they're not? So I'm guessing in like situations where we say like, this isn't the right camp for you then.
Yeah. I would only tell a camper that it wasn't the right camp for them if they could not agree to like live by inclusive guidelines of love and respect. And I think this kind of is rooted in basically we're saying like, these are our community guidelines. We're going to respect everybody's name and pronouns. We're going to make sure that everybody has inclusive spaces. If you don't want to share your pronouns, we're not going to make you do that. But where the ideological divide comes in is that some people just cannot live by that as truth, right? Like, I didn't go through like the whole truths that transplaining lives by, but like every medical association in the United States agrees that transgender and LGBTQ kids exist, and their best way for them to survive is that they are validated, right? So it is doing harm when we allow ideas in our space that don't affirm that. It doesn't do any harm in the other direction. So we are not harming cisgender straight kids by including trans and non-binary kids. There's no harm that's being done there. Again, like, you have to kind of concentrate on where the vulnerability is. And I hate it. I hate not being able to say like, yeah, everybody should be able to come to camp, but we expect certain behaviors in our camps. And some of that is like, we expect kids to not punch each other in the face. And if they can't do that, they can't be here. And it's hard to send that kid home, but that's harm. They're doing harm to another person. And if they're doing harm to another person, like, it's not the right space for them. it's taken me a really long time to be able to vocalize that. And I still don't know if I'm doing like the best job, but I really do think like that if inclusion is divisive, it's because people who are already included are saying that. Like they already have a spot in the tent.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I'm just kind of thinking from like my standpoint, like what I've said before as a camp director, and also in case people can't tell, I know Chris knows this, but I'm from the South and have always lived in the South. And so there's some divisive, there's a little divisiveness, I guess. Yeah. And it is really hard, but I was like having a pretty heated discussion with a family member last night, and I was getting heated and I was saying things in an unkind way. And I realized I'm making no progress. I'm making this worse. And I had to stop and remind them that, like, okay, where I'm coming from is a place of love. And I think that that's what, as we as camp directors can do too, making sure that we're not, when we're turning those families away, we're saying this isn't a great fit, we're doing it in a way that explains like it's because we're protecting kids, it's because we love kids, we value kids, and not be, and I know as a camp director, I've even had the instinct to be like, if you don't support and love our kids, then this isn't the place for you. Don't use that kind of like pushing language. Like, just
yeah. And I love what Gabby said in the comments is we would protect that same kid if someone was being harmful to them, right? Like if somebody decided that this kid, if we just started using a different pronoun for that kid than the one that they asked us to, or the one that they came with, we would do the exact same steps. We would manage that behavior in the exact same way, because using the wrong name and pronouns is an act of harm, period.
Right. I know we're close to time, so I'm just gonna do one last question that I think is,
yeah, let's do it.
Good. What terminology should we use for a cabin for all?
I like all gender cabin. So I think that the best practice there is so anytime you have a cabin, it has a cabin name that is much more interesting than the boys' cabin or the girls' cabin, because like ultimately, like that's kind of boring. You could name it like the Phoenix cabin or whatever. So you would say like we have this cabin, this cabin, this cabin. The Phoenix cabin is for campers of all genders. The fairy, I don't want to, no. I'm looking around. The tree cabin is for people who are assigned female at birth, trans girls, etc. Whoever we want to be in that cabin. So all gender should be kind of the term for a cabin that includes people of all genders. And then you would just define who else was allowed in other spaces. Oh, we had a Beaver Bob. In the Beaver Bob cabin, we have males regardless of sex assigned at birth and non-binary people who feel safe in a space that centers male experience.
Okay, awesome. Well, I think this has been fantastic. As always, Chris, thank you so much. If people want more information, they can find more of what you do at Transplaining. You're also a Summer Camp Society faculty member, which means that you are constantly cranking out amazing content for us, whether it's blogs or our Facebook Live or Instagram Lives or whatever else it is. So make sure that you're following the Summer Camp Society, following Chris on Transplaining on accounts all over there. If you want to share this with anyone, this will be on YouTube soon. We'll send that link out to everybody, so you'll have the ability to rewatch it and to share it with people. Chris is hosting a lot of the Summer Camp Society's staff training talks. So every day at noon, we're talking about noon Eastern, talking about staff training on our Instagram. And Chris, you have another amazing thing coming up next week, right? Is next week, right?
Oh yeah. So the considerations for trans health at camp. We are hosting Transplaining's official doctor, Dr. Kim Herman, who is a longtime camp healthcare provider, but also is a doctor who works specifically in trans medicine. So hope to see some of you folks there. It's going to be a good session.
Yes, and I will make the best effort to include that in the post Zoom email, so that I'll put it in chat right now, but I'm also going to make a big effort to put it in that post Zoom email. It is on the Summer Camp Society's site, just in case anyone leaves before. Because if you have something to do, I'm going to stay on for just a second and get this link in the chat. And again, I should be able to get it out in the email as well, but just in case something doesn't happen or somebody wants to do it right now before they forget, or you're passionate and you're ready to go tell your boss right this second, I'm going to pop it in the chat. And Chris also has some great, do you have any transplanting trainings come up? And are you any more open for summer now that you are a full-time camp consultant?
No, so I filled all of my summer before I quit my job, which was
okay. Wow.
like, okay, now I really have to do it. But I have some great staff training resources that you can facilitate at your own site. And Allison, I'll make sure that gets in the post email as well.
Okay, and that should probably go out. I think Zoom tells me to do it 24 hours after, kind of prompts me, so it will be tomorrow when that comes out. But we really appreciate everyone today. Thank you for being interested in this work. Thank you for being committed toward this work. And like Chris said earlier, small steps are steps, or whatever. The one thing that you could do is one thing that you can do. So thank you all for everything that you're doing at your camps. If you ever need support in any way, whether it's with this, with a program, you're just having a bad day, whatever it is, reach out to the Summer Camp Society. We are here to make better camp directors so that we can make better kids, so that we can make a better world. So thanks.